All right. Now, in my previous lecture, I had been speaking to you about the Mughals, and before that, the Portuguese presence in India, because I was trying to establish that there was a European presence in India before, of course, the coming of the British. And then I had given you the backdrop to the arrival of the British, which is that India cannot be viewed, obviously, as some kind of political vacuum, that there was a Mughal Empire. This was a vast empire. You know, around 1700, it is estimated that the population of Mughal India was perhaps something in the neighborhood of around 100 million. You did not have a census at that time. In fact, the census as an instrument of governance was going to be introduced by the British in the 19th century. The first census is going to be in 1871. But nonetheless, there are other ways in which one can try to estimate a population, and it's been, as I said, it's been estimated that the population was perhaps around something in the neighborhood of 100 million, which would have been much larger than the number of people under the jurisdiction of, let's say, the Safavids or even the Ottomans. Now, before we get to the history of the company, which I've already introduced the East India Company to you, but haven't really commenced its history as such, there is a prior set of questions which is raised by Nehru in his discovery of India. You're going to hear about Nehru later on as well, at least in passing. I just want to mention a little bit about him. Jawaharlal Nehru was a close associate of Mohandas Gandhi, otherwise known as Mahatma Gandhi, and one of the principal figures in the Indian struggle for freedom from colonial rule. In 1947, when India achieves independence, Nehru is going to become the Prime Minister of India, a position he'll occupy until he dies in 1964. And Nehru was also a writer. In fact, Discovery of India, which is a book from which you're reading a few excerpts, is one of three books that he writes while he's imprisoned by the British. Much of this book was written without really notes. It's a work that is written in extraordinarily elegant English. Most historians don't read it any longer because, of course, these were his personal opinions in a way. The book is now close to about 100 years old. Obviously, it's not a scholarly work in the way in which, let's say, Thomas Metcalfe's history is a scholarly work. But nonetheless, at least in my own, modest opinion about this book, if I may put it this way, I still think as a history of India, it's perhaps more readable than almost anything else that we still have down to the present day. The key thing for us is that we know that that India was ruled by the company from 1757 to 1858. Why 1858? Because in 1857 there's going to be what's called the Great Rebellion, and then at the end of that rebellion, which the British are going to crush, in 1858 the company is going to cease to really be the ruler of India. As we're going to find out, the company was not really ruling India in any case, in many ways, because there was parliamentary control, but you'll understand that in the course of things. But the key consideration for us is here: how is it that the British, who came to India as traders, how did they get transformed into rulers? Right? How did they get transformed into rulers? And what is it that enabled them to stay as rulers for such a long period of time? Now, there have been various kinds of arguments that have been advanced. So, for example, one of the arguments that's been advanced to explain how the British were able to transform themselves into rulers is the argument that there was a breakdown of organized power in India. The decline of the Mughals, the last of the great Mughals, as they're called, was Aurangzeb, as you might recall from the slide I had shown you last time. He dies in 1707. Now he's succeeded, of course, by another person, but the argument is that the Mughals basically had begun to decline. The empire was very large. You remember that at the extremities in particular, it's hard to control the empire. Think back, go back to these slides over here for a moment, right? So this is the portion that was added by Aurangzeb. There were always sources of resistance to the Mughal emperor who's sitting here in this part in North India. The sources of resistance would come from provincial governors, because the Mughal emperor would appoint provincial governors, that there would be a governor, for example, for this area over here, so forth and so on, right? And these provincial governors themselves became the sites of authority. It was sometimes hard for the Mughal emperor sitting over there to control them. It was also hard for the Mughal emperor to control zamindars. Zamindars, the word zamindar means landlord. Okay, but you know, when I speak about landlords, you shouldn't think of, for example, a Los Angeles slum landlord, right? The word landlord can mean many things too. I mean, these zamindars were people who controlled vast areas of territory. They knew the local population a lot better than the Mughal emperor did, right? They were able to command the loyalty of the local people. So very often, this zamindar would become a petty chief. In time, he might grow to become a major player, right? What I'm suggesting to you here simply is that the argument that the British were able to come into India, this argument, because of the Mughal breakdown, this argument rests on a certain understanding of what was happening in India in the 1600s, in the late 1500s, moving into the 1600s, that there is a decline of Mughal authority, particularly after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. And you've heard the expression, nature abhors a vacuum, right? That's the theory. So there's a kind of a vacuum in political power. Now, this theory is really contested. Unfortunately, if we were doing a specialized course in what's happening in the 18th century, we might begin to see what are the ways in which it's contested, because some people have argued, some scholars have argued, that there were regional kingdoms which actually became quite strong. So it's not like there was a vacuum there, it's just that there was no real central authority, right? But whatever the case may be, the question that animated Jawaharlal Nehru, and it's a question that is not unimportant, is how is it that the British were able to actually establish themselves, right? How did they get transformed from being traders into rulers? Then the argument is, well, that the British were willing to take risks. They had nothing to lose. Now, in order to understand that, let us try to understand a few other things. When the company is established in 1600, how was a company established? A group of merchants went to the Queen, who was the monarch at that time, Elizabeth, right? They go to the Queen and they say, well, we would like to receive a charter to be able to trade in the East Indies. So the Queen gives a charter on 31st December 1600, and this company comes into existence. Now, there was, around the same time, there is the Dutch East India Company. At around the same time, 1602, the Dutch East India Company comes into place. And one of the things I have not mentioned to you, but in a way it was, the question was sort of like implicitly there in a remark made by Lorenzo here, when he said, well, what's the difference between the Spanish and the Portuguese and their conquests and what the British and the French are doing, let's say, in the 18th century? Now, what I did not mention to you, and because this is the proper context now, is that, of course, there was some sense of rivalry that England had with Spain and Portugal. 1600, Spain and Portugal are already dwindling powers, but they're still there, right? You have to remember that the conquest of the Americas begins, of course, earlier, right? But, of course, Holland is also emerging now. Amsterdam is going to become a major center, and it is in that context that we must see the emergence of London as a major financial center circa 1600 once again, which is around the time that the East India Company now is going to come into existence, right? So all of these things have to be kept in mind when you're thinking about what's happening circa 1600 moving into that century now. And when Nehru says, well, the British were willing to take risks, what he means by that in part is not simply that they had some kind of entrepreneurial spirit, which was unique to them, but what he means by that in part is the fact that England was now trying to position itself as a competitor, right, both to Spain and Portugal, and more importantly to Holland and its capital, Amsterdam. All right. Then he argues, as many others have argued, that the Indian armies were relatively backward. All right? Because now we're not looking just at 1600, we're looking at 1600 moving into the 1700s, what enables the British conquest? Because remember, the question here is what explains the transformation of the British from being traders to rulers. And so that the Indian armies were backward. Now again, there is a whole body of scholarship on that, some of which doesn't really accept this hypothesis, some of which does. Because when we say backward, well, then we have to say, were they militarily backward, or were they backward in terms of bureaucratic organization? Right? Because what makes an army, a formidable army, is not simply military, sheer hardware. All right? You've got B-52s, or you've got, stealth fighters, so forth and so on. There's also the question of what is the bureaucratic organization of the army. Right? Then the argument is that the Rajputs, and who are the Rajputs? So the Rajputs are the martial caste in Western India, okay, and these are the people who had in fact actually opposed the Mughals, right? If we were looking at the long history of Mughal rule in India, we'd have to see what were the sources of resistance to the Mughals themselves. And some of this resistance came from a group of people known as the Rajputs. And when I say Western India, what I'm talking about is this part over here, which is not identified in the map over here. This is present-day Rajasthan, for those of you who know the geography of India, right? And the Rajputs were kind of viewed as a people who were like romantic. Well, they were fighters, but they didn't really have the kind of modern fighting skills that, let's say, that the British had. All right? The British represented a higher social order, by which Nehru and others meant that notions of bureaucracy, notions of efficiency, notions of organization were now getting much better developed in Western Europe, in Britain and other parts of Western Europe than in India. The Indians were not unified. This is a problem that of course continues. I mean, if you talk to any middle-class Indian, they'll tell you that one of the reasons why India remains backward is because Indians are not unified, right? Not unified in the same way, because of course someone would say, well, Trump's America is not unified. Right? Someone could easily say that. Well, how is it really different? They're the blue states, they're the red states, etc., etc. No, here the point being that there was enormous diversity, enormous linguistic diversity, religious diversity, right? So forth and so on. In other words, let's just simply translate that into the question, what makes an Indian an Indian? What is really common? What is common between a person who lives, for example, if you let's go back to this map, in order to adumbrate this particular argument. The principal language spoken here today is Tamil. I don't know a word of Tamil. Well, I mean, I know a few words of Tamil. I don't know the script at all. The principal language spoken over here is Malayalam. Okay, a different language. These are Dravidian languages. The principal language spoken here in Andhra is Telugu. Okay, and if you go over here, this is largely a Hindi-speaking area, or although there are varieties of Hindi, and then this is a Punjabi-speaking area. Right? I'm talking about 2017, and this is a Bengali-speaking area, different script, different language. Right? So what makes an Indian Indian? This is the question that you could ask and say that, well, isn't that a question that one could pose apropos of, let's say, any country? If you take China, well, there is one difference immediately, that yes, China also has diversity, by the way, much more so than we think. Nonetheless, 90% of China is Han Chinese, 90%. And Chinese is really, Mandarin is really the dominant, language that we're talking about. Okay. Now, and here I have to also tell you, by the way, that religious diversity doesn't simply mean that one thinks about a group of people known as Hindus and another group of people known as Muslims and Sikhs. That among Hindus, there's an enormous diversity. And as I've mentioned in passing before in this class, we will return to this argument at a later juncture, that before the 18th century, no person who the British called a Hindu, would call herself or himself a Hindu. They would call themselves a Vaishnava, that is a follower of the god Vishnu. Or they would call themselves a Shaivite, a follower of the god Shiva. Or they would call themselves a Shakto because they were worshippers of the goddess. The idea of female energy personified in the goddess, right? So forth and so on. They didn't call themselves Hindus, right? So this is the problem, that there was enormous diversity which continues down to the present day, notwithstanding the fact that everything under modernization is a way to actually introduce homogeneity, right? So there are enormous forces of homogeneity at work in India today, as they have been in many other parts of the world. But notwithstanding that, diversity is still really the hallmark of India in many ways. All right. So if you now let's go back to this slide that Indians were not unified. You see that the sense in which we are saying this is much more profound than when we say that, well, Trump's America is not unified, assuming that to be the case, right? Then the argument, well, that the British were much more pragmatic, I mean, remember the demeaning phrase used by Napoleon, right, for the English. They're a nation of shopkeepers. Yeah, they're basically people who are empirically minded. They're not interested in lofty metaphysical thinking, right? Whereas the Indians were daydreamers, They were daydreamers. That Indian philosophy lends itself to a very different mode of thinking, fatalistic, etc., etc. I'm not saying that I attach any credibility to that line of thinking. I'm just suggesting to you that these have been some of the arguments that have been advanced. But then we can also, I want to introduce a dimension that Nehru does not introduce, and I want to put it forward as a provocation for you. Namely, I want you to think about cosmopolitanism versus provincialism. Now, what do I mean by that? What are its implications? The narrative of the British in India has largely been written, right, as a narrative of how a backward country was eventually overwhelmed by a forward-looking people, i.e. the English, or the British more broadly. Right, that Britain was that there was an industrial revolution, for example. That's quite tricky because, of course, some historians have argued that the industrial revolution was itself precipitated by the British plunder of India. It's not like there was an industrial revolution and then Britain went and conquered India, right? That in fact one of the things that enabled the industrial revolution was the loot that came out of India. When in 1757, if we get to that point today, which we may not, but in 1757 the so-called conquest of India takes place by a man called Robert Clive. Robert Clive himself netted a profit of about 235,000 pounds. And the company, the East India Company, which he represented, netted a profit which was 100 times greater than that. Okay, in today's money, it would be worth something in the neighborhood of, let's say, 400 million pounds. The profit netted by the British at that point in 1757 itself. Right. So the argument here is that that essentially what we're saying is that the British were, outward looking. Okay, if you're an island people, perhaps you have to be, right? All right, they were outward looking. The country was moving forward, whereas India was provincial, backwards. Right? Now, I think, in fact, and this is not simply a matter of being a nationalist, I want to argue, I think that we can actually reverse the story completely in various ways. Right? Because I want to suggest to you, without making a long plea for it, because that would require a book, is that cosmopolitanism actually makes people vulnerable in many ways. It makes people vulnerable. When you open yourself up in various ways to various strands of thought and so forth, in many ways you become more vulnerable. Now, India was, by definition, much more cosmopolitan than England in the 18th century. If you simply look at it from the point of view of diversity, And I know that that can be complicated because you can say that, well, yes, there can be 1,000 languages that are being spoken by people, but what does that intrinsically mean? Why should one assume that that's actually cosmopolitan? Well, one of the reasons why that lends itself to cosmopolitanism is because each language does something that another language cannot do. Why is it that the Eskimos have 70 words for snow, and in English we don't have anything even remotely close to that? Because we don't deal with snow in LA, we don't deal with it at all, of course. But even if you're living in Minnesota or Buffalo or wherever, right, or Chicago, where you get 6 feet of snow once in a while, or 3 feet, right, you don't deal with snow on a daily basis in the way in which the Eskimos do. You have to be able to distinguish between different kinds of snow, the degree of moisture, to what extent is it solid, etc., etc. So what their language can do is something that English cannot do. Okay? Each language has certain characteristics which other languages don't. Right? And so linguistic diversity is not just diversity as an end in itself. It means something. And similarly, we're saying the linguistic diversity, religious diversity, all of that. Because after all, if you're a Muslim of a certain kind and you're a Hindu, quote, of a certain kind, you bring certain insights into what does the nature of the divine mean. Right? What is the nature of religious practice and worship and religious belief? So diversity does have some real significance in making a people much more cosmopolitan. And I want to argue, let me put it to you this way, again it's a provocation that I want you to think about, that what England actually did, which enabled it to, and this is an argument that Nehru does not consider, and I am putting it forward for you, what England did was it brutally homogenized itself. And that was the strength of its power in many ways. How did it brutally homogenize itself? In many respects. For example, every country, in order to, we become wiser, we become more human, both as individuals and as a nation, as a culture, when we learn to deal with dissent. Now, what did England do with its dissenters and its criminals? It shipped them out. It shipped all of them out. The dissenters came here, for example, many of them came here. Religious dissenters came to what was not then the United States, but the colonies on the eastern seaboard, right? They came here. The criminals, where were they shipped out? If you know the history of Australia, a convict colony. Go to Port Arthur, Tasmania. It basically did not learn to deal with diversity at all. And of course, England was a predominant language. In fact, the only one really, frankly. Okay, yes, I know there's Gaelic and all of that, but I'm saying predominantly, right? That's what England did. It homogenized itself brutally in all kinds of ways. And that, in fact, is one of the grounds for it becoming a powerful nation state, right? Which is why, even though people here who are dissenting today don't necessarily understand the implications of what they're doing, which is why one has to be extremely wary about what's happening in the United States. The forces of homogenization, right? The capacity or incapacity to deal with questions of dissent. And then finally going down that list, and we'll return to that argument, all right? The theory has been advanced that the British were kind of sucked into India. Because the question is, how did they get transformed into rulers? Well, they went there to trade. And yes, I agree. And I'll be the first person to tell you if somebody came forward and said to me, well, the British had this blueprint in mind. They had a grand design that they were going to conquer India. No, they didn't. No. It's not that there was a blueprint. On the other hand, the other extreme of that is, as an Englishman argued in the 19th century, to use his own phrase, and I'm quoting directly, John Seeley, he said that England acquired India in a fit of absent-mindedness. Right? England acquired India in a fit of absent-mindedness. Now that's the other extreme. The variation of that is the argument by the famous Cambridge historian, just passed away very recently, Chris Bailey, when he says the British were sucked into India. They went there and then You know, that's actually a long-standing Orientalist argument about India. India just sucks you in. You know, the caste system sucks you in. The Muslims go there, they're opposed to caste, they just get sucked in. You know, this humongous kind of, India is like this huge sponge. You know, wherever there's a spill, whew, use the sponge and it just absorbs it, you know. But that's his phrase, sucked. They were sucked into India, you know, all right? So I want you to now just only bear in mind this general framework. I'm going to have to defer questions for a time being because we're running behind a little bit. I want to try to see if we can catch up today. Okay, now let's go to the history of the company itself. So I've already told you that 1600, the company is going to be formed, and the voyages to the east will begin. By the way, the company actually had its own shipyards. Until 1637, the company actually built its own ships. After 1637, it actually began to lease them. It ceased building its own ships. And I've already considered the reasons which brought the British to India. So, you know, we have considered the whole question of, well, the whole Islamic presence in the Middle East, you know, that was the route. And then, of course, the Portuguese established the sea route. But the British were not, by the way, coming to India really for spices, because other than the Malabar coast, and when I say the Malabar coast here, I'm talking about, you know, western India over here, where other than the Malabar coast, you didn't really have spices. It was Indonesia or the Malay archipelago. Those were the spice islands, which is where the Dutch had gone. The English, other than spices from Malabar, what they were interested in from India were textiles. India was unquestionably the textile capital of the world by far. Even Marx in Capital Volume 1 talks at length about Indian textiles, including muslin. Muslin is this very fine, you know, yards and yards of muslin. It's so fine. You can take a cloth which is yards long and you can slip it through a ring. Okay, that's how fine it was from eastern Bengal, from Dhaka, the area around there. Calicos, so forth and so on. And even though there were import duties that were going to be raised in Britain moving into the late 1600s, even then the import of textiles into India, from India into Britain, continued to grow enormously. Okay, and as I've mentioned, I want to just reiterate, let's not forget this question of nationalism, that is that the British were seeking to compete with Spain and Portugal, and more importantly then with Amsterdam and with Holland. Some scholars have raised a question of Christianity, that, you know, were the British interested in spreading Christianity? Frankly, I don't think so. I know that Hindu nationalists, you know, are adamant in saying that, well, that's what Britain set out to do. I don't really think so. No, I'm not saying that they were saints and they were not interested in proselytization, but no, I think the British were not really interested in proselytization. And in fact, as I'm going to argue for you later, and there is enough documentary evidence to support that easily, that when the British took control of Bengal in 1757 and moving into the second half of the 18th century, in fact, the British forbid proselytization. They forbid it. And one of the reasons they forbid it, the company did not allow proselytization, was because the company was a business enterprise. And no business enterprise wants to deal with cultural matters, if I may put it this way. Because their fear was that if you proselytize, it's going to irk the Indians. It's going to anger them. And that can become a source of resistance and dissent. And it was not until that the British had secured the foundations of their rule in the early 19th century, in 1813, for the first time, the company was going to relax the rules for proselytization. All right? But that's a much later history. And also, a few other general remarks about the company before I get into the chronology. I'm a historian, so I'm supposed to get into chronology, right? But a few general observations, I think, of a different sort are also necessary for you to understand something about the company. I had mentioned to you that you should think of a modern-day corporation in many ways. In fact, the company is a precursor, frankly, in many ways to the modern day corporation. This also means that you have to understand that it is a profit-making enterprise and self-aggrandizing, right? That it very often will not recognize any limits to its own profit seeking. Now, someone always think, okay, of an objection to the argument. Someone here might say, but isn't it the case that if you look, for example, at the American corporation, take something like ExxonMobil, okay, any number of American corporations, Google, Apple, all of them are patrons. So when the LA Opera, which always runs in the red, so they need, where do they get their money from to run their very expensive operas, right? They get corporate sponsors, don't they? Right? And then when you go to the LA Opera, you'll see the list of corporate sponsors, and if you've given $1 million, the name is on the top, and then, it's done by amount, right? Okay? Same thing with all art institutions, museums in this country. So you would say that, well, isn't a corporation a benevolent entity? Yes, but this is exactly what we're going to find out. Some of the company's heads, okay, Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, right? He was a great patron of Indian learning. And so some people, they sort of, their guard is let loose, because then they think, oh, well, he was actually a very benevolent man. He was genuinely interested in India, in Indian learning, in Indian texts. Yes, he was. I don't question that. But Warren Hastings was a Governor General representing the East India Company. The East India Company is a profit-making enterprise. Warren Hastings never forgot that. He never forgot that. All right? And this is true of all of them. Yale University, by the way, if you do not know, you should know it now. Who is it named after? After Elihu Yale. Who was Yale? The governor of Madras in South India. That's where the money is coming from. It's a long history, but that's where the money is coming from. All right? So when we think of a corporation, I want you to keep in mind what this entity is. Okay? And we're not getting into the legal complexities, to what extent the company is or is not like an individual and can be held culpable. The company was so involved in the affairs of Britain that it is safe to say that in the late 1700s especially, there were very few families in England which did not have some involvement in some fashion or the other. I'm not talking about, working class families, but anything above that. Okay, the company was involved deeply in the affairs of India, and like the American military today, for example, was a huge, which is networked very deeply into American society. The company, in a similar fashion, was a presence in many English households. I had mentioned to you the case of John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher of liberty, who was employed by the company his whole adult life. His father was employed by the company. His brother, James Bentham, was employed by the company. The English essayist, Charles Lamb, was an employee of the company. He worked in the accounts department. Thomas Love Peacock worked for the company, another famous English writer. All right, so forth and so on. So think of the company in all of those ways as well, that it gave employment. In fact, I'm arguing to many families, and not only that, that many people were wound up with its affairs. All right. Now, next general consideration. If the company has come to trade in India, trade is usually two ways, isn't it? Right? You trade. So we get things from China, right, in the US, and they get something from here. So what is it that Britain exported to India?
Silver.
Yeah. No goods. Britain had nothing, zero, that India wanted or that interested India. This is not just my opinion. You might say, oh, that's a very conceited opinion. Well, just read the histories. you know, Britain, only thing they had were woolen clothes, which if you know India and its geography and its climate, unless you're going to be spending all your time in the Himalayas at 20,000 feet, in most of India you don't need woolen clothes. All right? It had absolutely zilch. And in fact, for many years, the only thing that went on ships was bullion. What is bullion, by the way? Yeah, but it's gold and silver, both, in bulk. In bulk. When you put it in the form of coins, it's called specie. Specie. Okay? Right? We'll just have to, yeah. Okay? It's bullion that basically went from Britain. And by the way, where did Britain get its bullion from? Because you don't really have gold and silver mines in Britain. Where did it get its bullion from? From the New World. There we get the connections now, again, right? From the New World, right? And what we're going to find is it's going to become much more complicated as we move into the 1700s, because we're going to find that when Britain becomes the ruler in Bengal and then the rest of India eventually, Britain is now, there's going to be a triangular trade, which is eventually going to lead to such complications as the Opium Wars. So we're going to, Britain, China, and India. Britain is actually going to be importing large amounts of tea from China. And they, again, in part, they're going to pay them with bullion. But we're going to see how opium is going to enter into the picture as well. All right. So this is the beginning of the trade. But I'm saying that we must begin with a kind of a anomalous situation, if I might put it this way, that Britain really had nothing to send except bullion. And it is not for no reason, therefore, that Alexander Dow is one of the British historians. He writes a book called History of Hindustan, 1773. Okay, so once again, I'm using a British source here, not an Indian source. I'm using a British source. He said in 1773, this is even after the conquest, the balance of trade was against all nations in favor of Bengal. Right? The balance of trade was always in favor of Bengal. When he says, when we say India, for him it meant Bengal, that eastern province which the British had occupied. And Dow goes on to characterize Bengal as, quote, these are exact words, the sink where gold and silver disappeared without the least prospect of return, end quote. That's what Bengal was. It just sucked in all of this gold and silver that the British had to send, okay, in return for such things as textiles, saltpeter, okay, which is used for gunpowder, indigo. Indigo is a dye used in textiles, all right? So that's the general. Now let's just look very briefly at a few figures, and let's look very briefly at the chronology that we're talking about. So 1600, the company is formed. In the early years, between 1601 and 1613, there are going to be 12 voyages, okay? And then the company is going to, by the 1640s, they're going to be what are called joint stock voyages. For the first voyage, by the way, the amount that was subscribed, when I say subscribed, what it means is that you had to collect the money, right? So these merchants who had petitioned the Queen, Elizabeth, for the charter, then they all contribute to the cost of the voyage. So they subscribed an amount of £70,000, for the first voyage. All right. And over the years, obviously, these voyages are going to continue to increase. Just to give you a sense of the profits, you get back to the chronology and how exactly the British sort of worked in India, because that's the other part that we're interested in. But just to give you a sense of what kind of profits are involved here, in the 1640s, the company's net profits were about 20%. By 1665, it had gone up to 40%. And between 1685 and 89, it had gone up to about 50%. This is notwithstanding the fact that the company is actually paying a substantial amount of money to the British monarchs. Because if you know the history of England, England itself was under absolutist rule. if I may put it this way. You've got the Tudors and the Stuarts. So the Stuarts, right, they're actually paying a substantial amount of money to the British monarchy, but notwithstanding that, they're still actually making quite a bit of money. Now, when the British traders came, they had to obviously get the permission of the Mughal Emperor to trade. Okay? The Mughal Emperor at this point in time is Jahangir. So there's a man called William Hawkins who's going to arrive. If you look at this brief chronology over here, he's going to arrive at the court of Jahangir. The Portuguese are still around. The Portuguese are still around, but the Portuguese, if you notice 1612, Portuguese lose some native battles, so they're already, lose them to the English, they're already on their way down, if I may put it this way. And I just want to make a little footnote here, that, you have to get the ear of the Mughal Emperor. What I mean by that is that an Englishman arrives at the court of Jahangir. Well, why should Jahangir pay any attention to him at all? I mean, it's worthwhile asking, right? Because after all, here's an Englishman who arrives at the greatest court in the world, possibly at that point in time. You remember the quotation I read out to you about, the Mughal Emperor and the jewels with which he was studied and the wealth of the country and so on and so forth. Well, who is this Englishman, right? And not only that, the Portuguese have been trying to influence, of course, the Mughals. So what the English have to do is they have to make sure they get a hearing, so to speak. Right? And this is where, again, you see this question of provincialism and cosmopolitanism comes in a different way. Let me explain what I mean. I want to ask, as not in a rhetorical fashion, but seriously, if you arrive at the court of the Mughal Emperor, how is an Englishman really much more foreign than a Tamilian from South India? Okay, or a person from Orissa in eastern India, right? The Tamilian and the person from Orissa, they both speak languages that are not the language of the Mughal Emperor. Hawkins and Sir Thomas Roe, 1617, who receives an audience at the court, so he's the ambassador, right? He's the ambassador sent by James I to, the Mughal Emperor's court, right? The question, let me rephrase it, is, were the English much more foreign than other kinds of Indians to the Mughal Emperor? You could put it that way. And of course, the reason I pose it this way is because the question is going to be, to what extent, as we move along in the 1600s, moving into the 1700s, to what extent did the Mughals really recognize that, well, the English were not just another people speaking another language that they didn't understand, that they might represent a different kind of threat that perhaps the Mughals never really fully understood, right? I mean, you could pose it in this fashion, right? And you could say that that was a sign of their provincialism, but it was also a sign of their openness, that, well, this person comes to the court and says, okay, I'd like permission to trade, and the Mughal Emperor gives him permission to trade. And when the permission to trade is given, he issues what's called a firman, a royal decree. And what did the British do then, right? So what they did was they established factories. Now the word factory is misleading, but I use that word deliberately because it's used in the literature. The factory is not a manufacturing unit as it is today. A factory, as it is used then, means a warehouse. So they established warehouses along the coast. Why do they establish warehouses along the coast? The answer, of course, is in a way self-evident once you think about it, because go back to this slide over here. These are European settlements in India. You notice that they're virtually all along the coast, right? Because you are collecting goods from the interior. Then you bring them to the warehouse on the coast, and from there the ships will take them, right? So they actually get permission to build various kinds of warehouses or factories, which is a word that is used, as I said, at that point in time. And if you look at the key over here, English settlements, the cross over here, so you're going to find, so this is the Hughley, because the Ganga will flow down, or the Ganges as it's called in the anglicized form, flows down into the Bay of Bengal here, and this is its over here, Calcutta over here, it flows down over here. So these are all going to be ports. The major British presence, if you Madras will be over here, right over here. You see this Madras here, so that's where you see the cross, but it's right here on the coast. This is going to be another port. All of these are places where the British are going to eventually establish warehouses or factories. All right. Now, they collect these goods, they bring them to the warehouses, and then eventually from there they're put on ships and taken back to England or wherever. One consideration that we need to think about immediately, and that is that there was a problem that the company had to contend with right from the very beginning. And that example that I gave you of Elihu Yale, the person after whom Yale University is going to be named, is a good illustration of that. That problem was that many Englishmen who arrived in India working for the company, they were in fact very often flouting the company's own rules. They were violating the company's own rules, by which I mean very simply that they were actually engaging in private trading as well. So they were not simply trading on behalf of the company and filling the company's coffers, they were filling their own pockets. They were filling their own pockets. This is going to become a major issue. The whole idea of corruption, for example. And when you move into the 1700s, this becomes a very major issue. If you look at the debates in Britain, it becomes a major issue because England, as we know, was hideously bound to class rules. And in many ways, some people would argue it still remains very much more so than the United States. I don't want to debate this point, but this has been argued that class hierarchies matter much more in Britain than they do in countries such as the United States. The relevance of all of this is what? The relevance is that the aristocratic elite in England started to worry about these Englishmen who had gone, very often who came from working class backgrounds. When they return to India, they are wealthy. These are upstarts, the nouveau riche. And the aristocratic elite don't like them, right? Because these are the people who are going to attempt to influence English politics. How do you influence English politics? You buy yourself a seat in Parliament, which is, of course, what you do in the United States in 2017 or 16. You buy yourself a seat. You try to run for a Senate. If you have anything less than $100 million, go take a dive in the ocean. You know, right? That's what you do. You buy yourself a seat, essentially, right? And that's what they were doing. And so they got extremely alarmed. And they said, this is corruption. This is corruption. Right? But the history of this goes back right to the beginnings. It's not something that started in the 1700s. These English traders who are filling their own pockets as well. Right? And they're going to be parliamentary, quote, inquiries. I love that, inquiries, because, this is a tradition that has continued in the Anglo-American world. You have these inquiries, right? And then, of course, nothing happens, right? It's like all these people who get, quote, grilled before the Senate for approval, and at the end of the day, they're all approved, because I hope you know that in the entire history of the United States, only 12 people, have been turned down when they've been nominated to the cabinet. All right? I hope you know that. Yes. Okay? Right? Okay? So after all this so-called grilling and everything, these are rhetorical exercises which make you think that, you're living in a real democracy, because people get seriously grilled before they can assume the position of energy secretary or housing secretary or whatever it is. It's exactly the same thing going on. There are these parliamentary inquiries all the way from the late 1600s to look into issues of corruption in the company. And of course, nothing really materializes, All right? So now, what we've seen is what? The company has slowly made inroads. They have established factories, they get permission. So if you look at the chronology, let's go to the chronology slide, over here. So Sir Thomas Roe is received at Jahangir's court. The company defeats the Portuguese in Surat. Surat is west coast of India. Okay, so naval power. England is a naval power, right? And remember, don't forget what I mentioned to you, that maritime exercise of power is going to become the decisive force here, all right? And this is the great shift that is going to take place there. Fort St. George, okay, so, now let me introduce, the word fort is important. So you've got, Fort William in Calcutta, in eastern India. You've got Fort St. George. That the British, when they build these warehouses, now what's the issue here? You have to be able to protect them, defend them, right? And you have to be able to defend them against any number of foes. For example, in the 1670s, the British have to think about this man called Shivaji. All right? So who is Shivaji? Okay, and I'll go back to the map there and show you the terrain in which he was. So Shivaji is this Maratha chieftain. Okay, Maratha chieftain. He is the initiator of what you might call a kind of a guerrilla warfare in India. And guerrilla warfare can mean many things, but in this case, one of the things it meant was these lightning raids, where you don't have big standing armies. The Mughals had these big standing armies, right? You remember what I mentioned to you in the last lecture, how big these armies were. 500,000 soldiers sometimes, right? Entire camps, cooks, washermen, you name it, right? Elephants, horses, massive. I mean, these are like cities, these standing armies. Now, the standing army also becomes more vulnerable in many ways. You're going on a long march. There are some people who always walk slower. They get left behind. They are the ones that the Marathas are going to pick on, right? So when I say guerrilla warfare, I mean in part that they basically conduct these lightning raids, okay, and then they retreat into their mountain strongholds. Shivaji and the Marathas had a whole string of forts, all right? And let me show you the terrain that I'm talking about here. So if you look over here at this map over here, so this is Gujarat. This is modern day Maharashtra over here. This is the area, Aurangzeb, for example. This area here. This is where Shivaji is based. But the Marathas were able to, by the way, launch attacks all over here. In fact, it used to be said that women in Delhi would try to put their children to sleep, when they had small children who were not falling asleep, by saying that, if you keep on crying, that's going to attract Shivaji, right? These were the kinds of stories that were told, all right? So you've got these attacks here, and particularly, of course, these installations here on the coasts are going to become vulnerable. So what do the British do? They have to now defend and protect their warehouses, so they basically build forts. When you build a fort, these are not forts of the kind that were built by Shivaji, which were massive structures, but basically a fortification. You place armor, you place artillery, guns, right? That's what it means to have really a fort. That's what the implication is that we need to be thinking about. All right, so the British are going to be able to, and again now I have to go back to this image over here, where you have the European settlements, right? So here's going to be Fort William over here. Fort William over here. Calcutta is, it's a long history. They're competing accounts, because the traditional narrative has always been that these were British ports. The British actually established. Those histories are nowadays contested. They established Madras, they established Calcutta, Bombay, I'm going to talk about in just a few moments. These are what are going to become the three presidency towns. They're called presidency towns. And these are going to become the three big centers of British power, moving into the 1700s and even the 1800s. So they're going to establish Fort William here. There's going to be Fort St. George over here, in Madras over here. All right? Right? So now what we have to be thinking about is how did the British expand further? Okay, how did they expand further moving into, because now we're talking about these forts 1640 roughly, right? Moving into the second half of the 1600s. Let me for a moment just go back to Britain. And again, that's important because very often when people study history of British India, they just are riveted on India. But we have to think about what's happening in Britain. Because there are obviously implications for what's happening in India over there. All right. In Britain, you have in the 1649, the monarch at that time is executed. That's Charles I. And the British monarchy is actually going to be abolished for a very short period of time, from 1649 to 1660. Right. The country is going to be under the rule of Cromwell, who dies in 1658, and then the British monarchy is going to be restored in 1660. So it's a moment of what? Turmoil, right? That would be the easiest way to really characterize it. Okay, Charles II is going to assume office in reigns of power, and you know that at his deathbed in 1685, he is going to actually convert to Catholicism. So now I mention this because we're saying there's religious tension. And one of the arguments that I made for you before, this is a good time to reinforce it, and I'm going to reinforce it at least 10 more times in the course of the next 8 weeks, is that one of the problems in the interpretation of the history of India, British India, right, here, is that the experience that the Europeans had of their own history becomes obviously the template for them by which they seek to understand India. Because if you really look at Britain, what we're saying is that there's actually a fair amount of religious tension, and not only that, there's obviously been the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, you've had a history of crusades, right? The question is how they understood religion when they came to a place called India, all right? Not simply how they understood a religion, if you want to call it that, called Hinduism, or a religion called Islam or Buddhism. Right? The question is, to what extent did their understanding of religious conflict impinge upon how they understood the interaction between religious communities in India? Right? So I'm saying that if you just look at the history of Britain itself, and here I'm not talking about what is happening on the ground in Britain. I understand that fully well, that you cannot extrapolate from what happens at the level of the monarchy to what happens on the ground. Right? Let me explain what I mean by that. It's very important that you understand that. That sometimes people have argued that under Akbar, the Emperor Akbar, okay, 1556 to 1605, that's when he's ruling, that India was very ecumenical. It was you had religious pluralism, so forth and so on. The problem with the argument, as they put it, I'm not saying, by the way, that I don't agree with that assessment. I may well agree. What is unfortunate is they use the example of the Mughal Emperor. But you see, what the Mughal Emperor can do doesn't tell you what ordinary people can or cannot do. Okay? In other words, you cannot extrapolate from the history of the elites and then assume that you know what the history of people is on the ground, what the history of people is who are working class, for example. You know, this would be a little bit like saying, you know, aristocratic women in India had the right to choose their own husbands, let's say 2,000 years ago, so therefore this tells us that India was very progressive with respect to how it treated its women. No. You can't make that inference, because the fact that Sita in the Ramayana can choose her own husband doesn't mean that all Indian women had that right. Not at all. You know, right? I'm mindful of the fact that even though I've been talking to you about Charles I and Charles II, that these examples may not tell us whether there was religious conflict on the ground in Britain. But of course, if we were doing the history of Britain itself, we would see that indeed that was very much the case. Okay. Now, moving back to India, I've already given you some sense of how the profits of the company are growing. Okay, and I mentioned to you Bombay here. So Bombay is going to now become a British possession in 1661. It is actually acquired, it's an island, it is acquired by the English as a dowry, because Charles II married a woman called Catherine of Braganza who had ties to the Portuguese crown, and that was part of the dowry. That right? It's a little bit like the history of Manhattan. You know what they say, right? That it was sold by the Indians, for $20 or something like that, right? And similar story in a way that we have for Bombay. Now, in the 1660s as well, a new factor. The French East India Company is going to be founded in 1664. The French want to get into the scene too. Why should all the profits be going to the British, right? And the French are going to establish if you look over here, Pondicherry, 1674. So look at the key there, right? The key here is these are French settlements here. These are French settlements here. And what we're going to find, there's one over here. We don't, by the way, have the luxury of looking at the whole history of the conflict between France and England in India. There was, of course, a conflict between France and England later on, including, of course, in the Americas. As we know, in Europe, we know that that's very much the case. So you can say that when these two countries are at war, there are going to be wars between them elsewhere in the world as well, right? That's the easiest way to really look at it. And we're going to find that there's going to be a rivalry between certainly the English and the French in India from the 1670s onwards, which is going to be resolved basically in the mid 18th century. Okay, now under Charles II, right? So remember that Charles II dies in 1685. He sits on the British throne from 1660 to 1685 for 25 years. The company is going to grow substantially. In India, the company is going to acquire new charter rights. Let me explain what I mean by charter rights. So recall that on the last day of 1600, the company received a charter from the Queen, right? So if you want to look at it very simply, you can think of it as a kind of a royal agreement, royal decree, permission. The charter is going to come up for renewal every 20 years. Every 20 years, particularly moving into the 1700s, this is going to be of some importance, right? And when the charter comes up for renewal, what kinds of questions come up? For example, what is the extent to which the company has a monopoly? At this point in time, the company has a monopoly on trade with the Indies from Britain. Okay? So if a rival group of merchants decided to establish another company in Britain to trade, they would not be permitted to do so because the East India Company had secured a monopoly. Okay? So the significance of the charter and its renewal is that the terms under which the company can trade, and not only that, when the company becomes a power, the terms under which it will govern, the particular modes in which it will govern, all of these things could come up for discussion. For example, should Christian missionaries be allowed to proselytize or not? And I had mentioned to you 1813. Why 1813 as the year when this rule is first relaxed? Because the charter had come up for renewal. And at that point, you could renegotiate the terms. Then you would have to wait for the charter's renewal again, okay, after another 20 years. So in the 1680s, the company acquires new charter rights, and among other things, it acquires the permission to mint money. Now the company is going to mint its own money. This is, by the way, significant because, of course, the Mughal Emperor is minting money too, right? But the company is saying, well, we'll mint our own money, and they actually get the permission to do so. They're going to have, the company acquires full jurisdiction over English subjects, in its factories and forts. So let's supposing that in Fort St. George over here, one Englishman murders another Englishman in 1660. Now, this Englishman shall be subject to the laws of which jurisdiction? Right? These are things that, they're almost arcane. You have to think about it, but if you were a scholar specializing in the history of the company, so would that person be subjected to Indian laws? Would they be subjected to British laws? Would they be if there were Indian laws, would they be the laws of that had been created by the Mughal administration in North India, or would they be subjected to the laws that were operative in India at that place at that point in time? What about religion? How would that factor into this? Okay, and what if an Englishman had killed an Indian? Right, so forth and so on. You think about it, right? So what's happening here in the 1680s is that, very simply, is that the company says that we acquire full jurisdiction, okay, over Englishmen in our factories and forts. So an Englishman who kills another Englishman, they have some fight over trade, whatever the case might be, maybe jealousy, right? That this person shall in fact be subjected to the laws of England. Okay? And the company acquires the power to make war or peace with non-Christian powers in India. Non-Christian powers means obviously the Mughals. It also means the Marathas, other Hindu kingdoms, regional Muslim kingdoms, so forth and so on. Okay? Now in 1688, the company feels that it is strong enough to take on the Mughal Emperor. Fatal mistake, because it's really not strong enough, and the Mughal Emperor at that time is Aurangzeb. And people have written about this at length. I'm going to give you the capsule form in 20 seconds. The company declares war on the Mughal Emperor. Aurangzeb is just going to crush them. He's going to crush them, but he's in a forgiving mood. Don't ask me why, but he's in a forgiving mood. Some people have said, well, maybe he shouldn't have been. The history might have been different. I don't know. Okay, he's in a forgiving mood. He reissues a firman. Firman is a royal decree saying, I confer your old privileges back on you. The company's officials come before the Mughal emperor. They prostrate themselves. Right? They basically have to lie down and rub their nose on his feet or whatever it is and say, we beg your forgiveness. And the company has to pay £15,000 in compensation to the Mughal emperor. Right? Those are the consequences. 1691, the matter is resolved. The company is back to its old ways. 1695, first big parliamentary investigation into corruption in the company. Okay, 1695, the first really big. There had been smaller inquiries, but this is now a full-scale parliamentary investigation because there are already too many stories about corruption within the company, people profiting by the side, doing private trade, which they shouldn't be doing, so forth and so on. Okay. Now, just to give you a different scale of things, how many employees did the presidency of Calcutta have in 1700 roughly? You want to make a guess? 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 70. There's 70 employees. 70 employees. Now there were others Englishmen who were there for various reasons. All right. But the company had circa 1700 about 70 employees over here. They had employees over here. They had employees in Surat and Bombay. These are major centers for the British over here. Okay. But we're still talking about a relatively small number of people. And if I could actually move just on this note, mid-18th century, circa 1750s, 1760s, Calcutta had 100,000 inhabitants and only 250 employees working for the company. Still a very small number. And this is what makes it all the more puzzling. That question that we keep on going back to, that Nehru had started, at its height of power, the British had, the company had at its height in the, let's say, 1830s, 1840s, 100,000 at most. And that's a really huge number. It's much smaller. Okay? employees in India. But the population of India, circa 1700, we say 100 million, right? So how did the company actually rule? And that's when, of course, we're going to get in the next lecture to such things as governing structures. How was a conquest actually? Because we haven't gotten to the conquest yet, right? We're still now in the early 1700s. 1707, Aurangzeb is going to die. And it's also important to add that the East India Company had its own army. All right, so the armies of the East India Company. So, and I use the word armies in the plural because it was the army of the East India Company over here in Calcutta, the army of the East India Company in Madras. And again, what were the number of people who were actually employed in the army? So in the army of Madras, you had 300. In the army of Bengal, you had 500, roughly, giving you rough figures, All right. Now, Aurangzeb dies, and this is where that old narrative kicks in that, well, now the Mughal Empire is going to start to collapse because his successor, Farrukhsiyar, doesn't have the kind of muscle that Aurangzeb had, doesn't have the stomach to rule in the way that Aurangzeb had, so forth and so on. I'm not interested in assessing to what extent all of that is true. What is certainly true is that in 1717, Farrukhsiyar is going to grant exemption from duties to the East India Company. Because the company had to pay duties, right? For when it's trading, it actually grants them exemption, and this is going to remain true officially until 1857, which is when the company is going to more or less cease to exist. There's a technicality here that the company is going to cease to be a power completely in 1857-58 when we get to that, the Great Rebellion. But the company officially was not abolished actually until a couple of decades later. So this also means that in 1717, the British have a right to trade without payment of customs duties, except for a very nominal, very, very nominal sum of money. I think it was a few thousand, rupees. All right. Now, we'll get to the conquest in my next lecture, but let me just take another 2 minutes. That's it, and get up to the 1740s, 1750s. So what's happening is that Pondicherry here. Over here, Pondicherry has been growing as a French settlement. It's become quite important. There's going to be a French general who is going to take command of French forces. His name is Dupleix. And what we're going to find is that in order for the British to establish their superiority, they're going to have to eliminate the French. One other important thing that you must really bear in mind, and that is that whatever our narrative of what happened after the death of Aurangzeb and the so-called collapse of the Mughal Empire, and I've mentioned to you that, in fact, what many historians will today argue is that there were actually regional centers of power that emerged. Well, maybe not one big central authority, but there were regional centers of power. It's not as though there was anarchy there, all right? There are regional centers of power that emerged. If that was the case, which I would say is certainly true, that is important for us because we're going to find that Indian rulers are going to be quite willing to accept assistance from either the British or the French. So let's supposing you have a competition for power, right? The Mughal Emperor's authority is no longer running over here, let's say. Okay, we're going to find, in fact, and I'm picking the example of Calcutta over here, the region around Calcutta, because we're going to find that there's going to be a ruler that is going to become important in 1756, a very young man, and we're going to find that they're members of his own family who are opposing him. Okay, so what happens typically in a case like this? That one ruler says, I'm going to seek the assistance of the British, and remember, the company has its own armies. Okay, it has its own armies. I'm going to seek the assistance of the British, and the other person who is competing for power in the same area says, I'm going to seek the assistance of the French. All right? So what we're going to find is that, in fact, in many of these cases, the British and the French are now going to be fighting alongside one Indian ruler or the other, and obviously will extract their pound of flesh for doing so. Yeah, they're not doing it out of charity or something like that. They're going to obviously extract their pound of flesh. Right? So this is the scenario that we are really leading up to in the 1740s and 1750s, where we are saying that the French have become something of a power there. The English have, let's just summarize, the English have established themselves in a number of areas. Okay, in fact, under Charles II, the company has arrogated certain rights to itself. The Mughal Empire itself has not collapsed as such, but certainly this kind of authority that was wielded by Aurangzeb is no longer there. Right? That's the context now for what it will emerge next, which is what we're going to do. We're running behind by about half a lecture, but we'll catch up. Okay?